Ghislaine Marion Maxwell was born on Christmas Day 1961 in France. Raised in a Jewish family, she was the youngest of 9 children and grew up privileged, to put it lightly. To get a better understanding of the world in which Ghislaine grew up in and how she ended up becoming the person that she did, you need to know about probably the most influential person in her life, her father, Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell was a former member of British Parliament and he owned major British media publishing companies. Robert Maxwell was described as rude, arrogant, ruthless and impatient. These words sum him up, and he sounds like the type of person who you'd rather avoid. He had taken a lease on a place called Headington Hall in Oxford and utilised it as his office space. It had 53 rooms, and so he'd eventually end up moving his family onto the property. To celebrate and pay homage to his Jewish ancestry, he had a stained glass window made which showed Samson at the gates of Gaza fitted into the property. Robert Maxwell was doing well for himself, and to his credit, his origin story is pretty unique. Maxwell had originally come to the UK from Czechoslovakia. His family was skint and he'd gone from rags to riches because he was smart and knew how to form business connections. Maxwell presented a flashy lifestyle to those around him and to the public. This could have been because he wanted to compensate for his lack of wealth and status back in the day. Despite this affluent existence, not everything was all that great in the Maxwell household. Robert Maxwell routinely shunned and hit his children, telling them that they'd never amount to anything. He wasn't the typical supportive father, but when it came to Ghislaine, she could do no wrong. Ghislaine was still subjected to abuse from Robert, but for whatever reason, she was put on a pedestal by him. Many parents don't want to admit to having a favourite child, but Robert would openly admit it. Ghislaine grew up spoiled and got everything that she wanted. She was basically that Fiat 500 meme. As a result of this favouritism, Ghislaine received plenty of opportunities. She would attend prestigious schools in Oxford and eventually began studying history and French at Balliol College in Oxford. Ghislaine was surrounded by future British Prime Ministers and basically the elite. She would often be seen at parties hosted on campus, and these parties enabled her to gain a skill that served her well later on in life. That skill was the ability to network. She made people feel welcome, comfortable and at ease. Ghislaine would introduce more quiet and reserved students to one another, and with her good looks and charm, she transformed herself into the life and soul of the party. Because of Robert Maxwell and his influence, Ghislaine was well known around campus. She appeared in the newspaper, no surprise there, and she had a good reputation around Oxford. However, according to friends of hers, this good-looking and confident exterior seemed to mask deep insecurity within her. She was always talking about her father and lived in his shadow. Ghislaine was also deeply involved and interested in sex and pushing boundaries. This would take a much darker turn later on in her life. She would often be the one to initiate straight up advances like demanding a guy take her out to dinner, and despite this being seen as something that is more masculine, it has been said that she could at times present a more masculine and dominant energy. A clear example of her interest in sex and pushing boundaries was seen at a party. Ghislaine insisted that the men be blindfolded and the women at the party take off their bras. The men would then have to guess the person based on, well, you get the picture. Obviously, this pushing of boundaries fulfilled some deep inner need for Ghislaine. She put the fellow women in a position where they felt obliged to take part, and that is a pretty big red flag, a foreshadowing toward her future character. Over time, this type of behaviour could be observed when it came to underage girls and the future scheme that she'd be involved in. As Robert Maxwell made business moves throughout the UK, Ghislaine would ultimately graduate in 1990 and wanted to try out her own business. Ultimately, she ended up getting a job working for Robert's newspaper company, The European. Ghislaine would basically become her father with his same personality and dislikable traits. When not at work, her outgoing side and skill to bring people together, making them feel welcome, proved to be a game changer for her. And this, plus her desire to serve and receive love and praise from her father, kept her ambitious, as like anyone, she wanted the approval of her parent or idol. In this case, Robert was both to her. He was the person who she felt closest to, and he funded her extravagant lifestyle and her time spent in the media limelight. In 1991, Ghislaine ventured to New York City alongside her father, and Robert had connections there. The United States was a new beginning for Ghislaine, and her and Robert were becoming successful in the media game in New York City. However, despite everything going well, something bad was on the horizon. It was in late 1991 that an unforeseen event took place. Robert Maxwell was on board the Lady Ghislaine, you can probably guess which child he named the yacht after, when he ended up passing away after an apparent accident. In reality, it was likely Maxwell died as a result of a planned hit off the coast of Spain. It has been said that he was a part of multiple Secret Service organisations, and people wanted him out of the picture. Shortly following his death, the news that Robert had been an even worse person came to light. He'd stolen hundreds of millions of dollars of people's pension money. The Maxwell name quickly went down the toilet, and Ghislaine was severely depressed and practically on the verge of ending it all because of the loss of her father. Spending more time in New York City now, she would continue lapsing up attention at parties. Ghislaine loved to be the main centre of attention, and as her network of famous and influential people grew following her father's death, she would end up meeting a man who would change her life forever. That man was named Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was already wealthy, and his life is shrouded in secrecy, which isn't surprising given the people who he associated with. Ghislaine and Jeffrey grew closer, and the relationship that they shared was essentially the father-daughter one that Ghislaine had with Robert, but it was far more warped and disturbing. Jeffrey had needs, the main one being a sexual need, and Ghislaine helped to fulfill his needs. She provided Epstein with her contacts, and despite the many unknowns of this case, we do know that Ghislaine eventually began acting as a procurer of young women and girls for Jeffrey. Ghislaine found young girls in Central Park, and she was an effective and efficient recruiter. Her life was revolved around bringing Jeffrey young girls under the guise of modelling or massage work. Ghislaine referred to these girls as trash and didn't have any morality whatsoever. Both Ghislaine and Jeffrey played hands-on roles when it came to the abuse of vulnerable young girls. Originally, one of the victims reported the abuse in 1996, but because of the high profile and powerful nature of people involved in the case, nothing was done. From 1996 and onwards, the child procuring operation grew, and the scope of the whole thing is probably being kept hidden. A major blackmail scheme involving underage girls sounds very plausible in this case given hidden cameras in Epstein's New York property. But any other potential schemes that existed still remains a mystery to this day. When Epstein was first arrested in 2005 down in Palm Beach, Florida, and during this Ghislaine wasn't even investigated, Epstein received what was known as the sweetheart deal and avoided life imprisonment. By this stage, Maxwell had already taken a back seat to recruiting young girls. She now had other young women recruiting girls for a paycheck. Maxwell avoided any charges in Epstein's Florida case back in 2005. Law enforcement knew her name, but nothing was done. In the years that followed, she ended up distancing herself from Epstein. She took part in fundraising and portrayed herself as some type of environmentalist. In one fundraising campaign for child victims of sex trafficking in Haiti, Ghislaine can be seen posing for the camera alongside the organisers. She never contributed to the good cause. Ghislaine had dodged serious punishment for years by this point. She must have felt untouchable. However, following the arrest of Epstein in 2019, public pressure began to emerge with the case as people wanted the truth to come to light. Epstein ended up being found dead in his jail cell months following his arrest. He had a snapped neck, and despite nothing about his demise adding up, it was labelled as a suicide. Maxwell would remain free until she was finally brought to justice, arrested in New Hampshire in 2021. At her trial, she was found guilty and given 20 years. In conclusion, the Justice.gov website says that Ghislaine was active in the recruitment and abuse of minors for roughly 10 years, from the years 1994 to 2004. In that time, both her, Jeffrey, and other associates abused many young girls and ruined their lives. Thankfully, Maxwell was handed down a 20-year sentence. However, her trial and the fact that this case was hushed by the mainstream media really says it all. The evil that exists in this world is clearly illustrated by this case and the mysterious death of co-conspirator Jean-Luc Brunel. And the lack of accountability with people like Prince Andrew make this case both dark and interesting. But this case would have never been possible or even made it to the headlines without Ghislaine Maxwell. Her ability to network and not make mistakes, as she put it, had her operating at the top of a major trafficking ring for a long time. The Maxwell family reputation is now forever tarnished, and Ghislaine now has to sit in prison for 20 years. Well, at least until the case publicity dies down and she gets let out early. That is the cold reality of cases like this. This has been the story of Ghislaine Maxwell. As always, thank you for watching.